The science of identity is one of the most significant sciences possible because identity, the habit of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being, determines 90% or more of our future as a species and as an individual. 80 to 90% of human interaction, of human life, is semi to largely unconscious habits. And those habits are defined by identity, meaning the narrow band consciousness of the conscious mind can only handle maybe at most 5 or 10% of the different decisions and responses that we're all faced with on a daily and yearly basis. And so in order to accommodate that very limited kind of in-the-moment choice-based attention, we put most of our life on autopilot, and we do so with identity. Now, all identity is a habit. If we look in the mirror, we look at the atoms and molecules, and it's like they look similar than they did yesterday. They've maintained the cohesion of their habit, of their identity. And so we recognize the body. We recognize the thoughts, the feelings, the beliefs, the paradigms, the words, the tones, in the same way. We look at the thought and we say, is that the kind of thought that I would think? And who's I? Well, we just look at the common habits of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being over the last period of our life, and we say, that's me. I'm the one with those habits. I always wake up at this time. I always think this. I eat this. So it must be me because I'm the one who does that. But how did these habits form? And more importantly, why do we cling to identity so tenaciously? Because if identity is just a habit of thinking, feeling, speaking, and doing, and identity is never the best habit, meaning you can pick any person's pattern and you can improve upon it. You can say, yes, I am the person who rolls out of bed at 8 a.m. and slams the alarm clock and feels terrible and then eats the food that makes me sleep poorly and do this. I am that person. But is that the best person? What if I had a habit of getting up at 6 a.m. and doing yoga and doing this and then doing this? Wouldn't that be a better habit? Yeah, but it's not me. But what makes your habit you? Your habit of thinking, feeling, speaking, and doing is that, your habit of thinking, feeling, speaking, and doing. But identities develop in response to an environment. And they develop to meet the human needs, to survive, to feel secure, to have love and belonging, to have self-esteem, to develop our abilities, to bring those valuably into the world and become part of something bigger than ourselves. So identity is a habit that didn't just come out of nowhere. It's a habit that seemed to facilitate in a given environment our ability to meet our human needs. And there is a better habit. There always is. On the continuum of intelligence, on the continuum of grace, there's always a better way. There's always a more efficient way of transforming energy into sustainable human well-being. It's just we don't know that way. And if we give up our identity, we're faced with the unknown. And without an identity, we don't know how to respond. Because how the decision-making process typically looks, 9 times out of 10, is we think, what would what does me do in this type of situation? And why do I do that? Oh yes, I have these thoughts and these beliefs and these behaviors, and so that's what I'm going to do, because that's the kind of thing that habit would do. I just scan for consistency, meaning if I'm a believer, I've developed the habit of believing in good conservative policies, and people should work for a living. And so charity breeds rot. You give something, makes people lazy, and this is my belief. And I make sure to act consistently with my belief. I don't give money to beggars. I don't give money to this. Instead, I point to the fact that I built this business myself. So this is my habit of thinking, my habit of feeling, my habit of doing, my habit of speaking. That's me. Well, I could just wake up and say, who wants $1 million? Or, but how would I get from here over to here? Like, what would make me do that? If I believe that leads to rot and it doesn't seem to fit very well. So that's not me. So I have to reject that probability field because it's inconsistent with my identity. Well, of course, all identities are false in the sense that they don't work all the time. What if that $1 million I had the impulse to give that one time was going to go towards a project that led to this and led to that and would have funded this and led to that, and all the things that I say I wanted would have occurred in much greater number doing that. But then how do I know? What if it doesn't work that way? So the identity is protected and defended because narrowband decision-making consciousness is overwhelmed easily, is a good way of putting it. And so if you can think, breathing is automatic, digestion is automatic, urination is automatic, defecation automatic, driving you can pretty much look around, it's on the automatic system, you've trained your body how to do that. Because you can do that when you're driving in a similar part of the world. If suddenly you drive to a completely different car where if you unconsciously drive, you're now on the wrong side of the road, you've got a problem. But we try and slow down the change, the variability, the uncertainty in our life to a point where it doesn't overtax the very narrow, limited, respond to a completely unique decision and situation type of consciousness. So as we're driving on a regular routine and we've got our life handled, we can maybe digest a new audiobook on the drive home, and that little 10% of new decision-making and awareness can be focused on that audiobook. But as soon as we see there's a forest fire and there's gunmen running across the street, we have to turn off the audiobook. The driving can still be automatic, we've learned that, but we have to respond and start thinking with that unique sliver of responsive conscious moment type of stuff. We have to do that with and respond to the biggest threat in the environment. So identity runs most of the ship, runs most of the system, so to speak. And the reason we cling to it as a habit is both that habits are the only things that can be unconscious, meaning if it's variable at every moment, we can't relegate it to the part of the brain that is going to do that habitually. So we have to relegate that to habit. The other thing is the habits that we've picked amongst the selection of habits that we tried out and are available to us were the habits that worked. Meaning I didn't just randomly develop the habit of a warm smile. I noticed that This person who had a warm smile was was welcome in many places, and that opened doors. So I thought that's a good habit. I tried it myself. People liked it. I liked being liked. Okay, there's another reason. Feels kind of nice on the face, and I feel a little better. People smile more back at me. So I've got 4 reasons to do this habit. So let me cultivate, hello, nice to see you. Let me cultivate that habit. And since it's working and no one's dying as a result, I'm just going to put that on autopilot. That's me. That's the habit that I've created. That's my identity. I'm the one that does that. And if I suddenly stop doing that, people will say, you're not yourself. Meaning you're not doing the habitual thing you decided to do. So identities are necessary because the individual ego is completely overwhelmed with all the choices and decisions, where to drive, where to eat, where to do, whether to eat or not, whether to fast, whether to do this. What do I do when I can do anything for all reasons at all moments, at all times, and there's no habit, there's just completely coming out of the moment? What do I do when there's no identity? It's overwhelming. I don't want the responsibility for it all. And so I said, well, what do I normally do? I normally go home, I have a cup of tea, then I do this, and that works, meaning I'm still alive. No one's angry about this and that particularly. It works. It's an identity that works, that fits into the environment, and that narrows the bandwidth of choices I make to a level that I don't feel terrified and overwhelmed making them. The identity also protects us from the unknown because the known reality that we live in is facilitated and enabled by our known identity. If we suddenly started behaving, thinking, feeling differently, other people around us would change as well. But we don't know how they would change because it's in the unknown. Our life would change and the ripple effects of that life would change, but it might change for the worst. It could change for the better, but it could also change for the worst. And one of the safest equations to make around an identity is what are everyone else, what are other people doing? Because it generally is mediocre, but it's not going to be the end of the world. Meaning if you're doing what everyone else is doing, it's probably not going to be as horrible as it could be. It won't be as great as it could be. It'll be average. And so, if I'm overwhelmed or I don't know how to think or I don't know how to design an identity, which why would you in a psychologically illiterate culture? If I don't know how to design an identity that is science-based, meaning if I talk like this, think like this, feel like this, act like this, and be like this, I will consume less energy and generate more sustainable well-being than if I talk like this, speak like this, feel like that, act like that, be like that, spend money like that. And so I'm going to follow the science. But it's there is a fear of the loss of identity because it's the fear of overwhelm and the fear of the unknown. And so identities typically like and need to move at a pace that the conscious mind can kind of keep up with and track and reassure that the world is not going to fall apart. Now, every identity has a load, an energy mass that is holding it in place. And it's that load that I want to explore here. So one part of the load is the fear of the unknown. The more traumatized you are and have been, the higher your fear of the unknown will be. Because anyone who has been traumatized recognizes that they cannot deal with the trauma. If they can deal with it, it's not a trauma. So all trauma comes in a face, in a mask, where the narrowband conscious mind and the existing identity try to process that mass of energy and can't. It's too big. You know, it's like trying to suck up a river with a straw. I'll drown before I digest this energy. The energy is too big. That's one problem with trauma. The other is it's too shocking. It's too violent. It is in violation. It's not attuned to me. It's disorganizing me. I'm not organized. It's disorganizing me. So the energy is shocking. It's too big. It's too shocking. Another is it's too unfamiliar. It's whatever it is, I don't know, which means it brings up the fear of the unknown. Because if you think of, for example, meeting an alien, maybe they're 3 feet tall, maybe they have big eyes, maybe they have shiny skin, whatever. You meet an alien. It's not, of course, an alien. It would have its own name and all of that. But to us, we've never seen it before. So there's a pattern of energy there, an identity, and it is unknown. Now, the fact that it is unknown means it could have a contagious disease, much like when the Europeans came to the Americas. They brought with them diseases that herd immunity had built up in Europe, but they'd never been exposed to those diseases. And so, smallpox and things, there was a lot of death through just exposure. And so you meet an alien. Do they have an electrical charge in their body that if you touch them, you'll be electrocuted? We have a very, very tiny amount of voltage in our body, but who's to say how systems evolved in other places? So is there, but on every metric, diseases, electricity, physical strength, it's all unknown. And in the unknown is a middle line. On this side of the line, everything's better than the status quo, and on this side of the line, everything's worse than the status quo. And when it's unknown, it's in the middle. So it could be an absolute disaster, or it could be absolutely wonderful. But the mind defaults to the negative, because if it's absolutely wonderful and you went and hid, you're still alive. But if it's absolutely horrible and you didn't get away, you're dead. And so there's a bias towards the negative around anything that's unknown. And this comes from a traumatic history, culturally, globally, and individually, that says that sometimes things that are unknown really hurt us, and there's no help. And we're overwhelmed, and we feel terrified and lonely. And so the load of our unknown, determined in part by our traumatic load, are the amount of fear and terror repressed and regressed in our body at different times in our growing up process, means that the more traumatized we are, the more frightened of the unknown we are. The more frightened of the unknown we are, the more frightened of change we are. The more frightened of change we are, we don't want to change our identity. So that fear is holding us in place. Now, the value of certainty in being held in place is that it has worked so far. The danger of certainty is that the outer environment is always changing. New diseases, new balances in the ecology, different weather, all kinds of things are always changing. And if you remain fixed and fixated on a very specific identity and don't correlate that with the outer environment, eventually the identity that kept you alive in its rigid form becomes the identity that kills you in its rigid form. And, in very slow-moving environments, that may not happen in 100 years. But if you were rigidly doing what people were doing 1,000 years ago and refusing to learn and to change, you'd very likely be dead, either because people would kill you. Let's say you just decided to be a 1,000-year-old doctor practicing leeches. In the framework of our cult, if you put too many leeches on too many people and call it medicine without a license, someone's going to kill you. They're certainly not going to pay you. And so that would be an honorable identity 1,000 years ago when leeches were the new greatest thing. 1,000 years from now, they'll look back at OxyContin and various things triggering the opioid crisis as worse than leeches. They'll say, what were they doing? They started out with leeches, that was bad, and then they made it worse. We don't allow anything of that, in our century. But we're dealing with identity. Now, we have the fear of change, and then we have the environmental punish-reward cycle. The environmental punish-reward cycle is composed of kind of memory. What is my memory? What is my daily experience? Like when I use this identity, when I practice these habits, what does my reality tell me? For example, if I have an identity of being wary as I walk through the jungle, and I always avoid the snakes because that wary identity, I look here, then I look here, then I walk 10 paces, I scan, I have my pattern of smelling, listening, and I'm able to avoid predation. And so I say, this is a good identity. I'm staying alive, I'm staying alive, I'm staying alive. And I'm fear of change. So you have the reinforcement of reality feedback and fear of change. But we also have people feedback. Let's say you are a Western journalist and you're entering Maoist China. Now your identity, your habit of thinking, feeling, speaking, and doing is clear, you've defined it, and it's relatively well rewarded in your culture. But now you're entering a communist dictatorship. And the biggest fear of people in power, generally speaking, is of losing the power. I'm head of the Communist Party, and so that fear, this is my identity, I don't want it to change. I don't want it to disappear. And so this fear of losing that pattern, because if I'm no longer in power, I will have to change my identity. I can't go around ordering people to be beheaded and, don't charge my mother rent or we'll be after you. That's an identity of a dictator that works when you're the dictator. But it doesn't work when someone else is the dictator and you're pretending to be the dictator, then you get beheaded for challenging insurrection, of the dictator. And so it doesn't work. So in that, if you're head of a system that is causing massive amounts of suffering, killing, terrorizing large numbers of people, and you're telling people that the reason you're doing all this is for their own good, like so many parents. If you bring the truth of and a journalist notes and gathers anecdotes and talks with 100 people and says 70% of them are starving or not very happy or frightened of being turned in and spying on other people. And this is the reality. You're doing what your identity suggests, but you are a threat to the dictator, because the dictator's position is based on the truth being suppressed. And so when you understand that you're dealing with a dictator with a habit of killing and executing and this and that and the other, and a thought that that's the way it should be, and feelings like, well, that's the way it should be, there's a collision of identity. Because if the journalist publishes the truth and everyone really grasps that there's just one person up there and the whole country is suffering because of that person, because of that person's dogma and policies, etc. Well, when you have that awareness, then that threatens the identity of the dictatorship. But it also threatens the identity of the culture and the country, meaning the country is going to face change. The dictator is going to face change. The culture and the country are all going to change if this one person does their identity. If this one person writes a detailed account of how people are doing mentally, emotionally, physically, sexually, dietarily, etc., and compares that to, for example, a Western culture, where people are doing noticeably better for obvious reasons. Now, because every human being in the history of humanity wants to feel sustainably better and avoid feeling chronically worse, and because communism was developed with that goal, and Karl Marx explained how and why people would feel better if there was no classism, no racism, no religiosism, and everyone was equal. And all the people who suffered the inequalities of their current cult said, yeah, it would be better. Yeah, that makes sense. I'm on board. I'm sick of this person looking down at me because I'm not a millionaire or I'm not a landlord. I'm sick of being the butt of jokes because I'm not born a lord, and I'm sick of this, and I'm sick of that. I want to get rid of all that suffering, and I want to have equality. Hey, comrade, that's what I want, of course. So let's have a revolution. We'll get rid of all those autocratic assholes. We'll have a lovely, balanced, flat culture. There's plenty to go around. And, just to make sure it all works, we'll have these people here controlling it for your own good. And, it didn't work. It didn't work because of the centralized power, because of the natural nature of power to corrupt, because in a traumatized culture, most of our leaders are terrified of losing their identity as a leader and would like to hold on to it. And because all systems have faults, and the communist system had many faults, and so the truth then becomes the enemy of the regime, and you need to spend more and more energy suppressing the truth in order to prop up the regime. But one journalist doing their job and publishing across the internet or across all the newspapers their findings is a threat to the identity of a culture, a country, a dictator, and all the different power structures under the dictator. And so if they want to express their identity, to be themselves, they are going to start experiencing resistance. Oh, don't tell anyone you said that. You'll be killed. And you begin to see the mass of the identity around you. meaning there's an identity here that says that communism is wonderful, it's great, it's going to solve all ills, and look at all our things here. And then there's a complete truth suppression regime to discount and disavow all evidence to the contrary, and to highlight and exaggerate all evidence for. So we'll exaggerate all the evidence that we're doing a great job, and we will suppress and hide all the evidence we're doing a terrible job, because that will maintain the identity. You know, don't you remember Karl Marx? He was going to do this, and he said this, and we said we're in for this, and that's what we're doing here. You know, let's stop the negativity. Let's stop the naysayers. You know, we have to have centralized quotas, and you have to send all your grain to the central warehouse, and you have to overlook the fact that the people at the top all have bread, and you don't because you sent it all to Moscow. You got to think about all these things and notice, you know, and deal with the fact that your neighbors have become cannibals just to survive the winter. But we can't have real data coming out. So there's a collision. One journalist and an entire country, cult, and power structure. Now, all wars are wars of identity. I want to do this pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. And I want to do this pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. And my pattern dictates that we go like this, and your pattern dictates that you go like this, and there is a collision of identity. In a collision of identity, think of it as a territory. This is the Palestinian homeland. No, this is the Israeli sacred something. You know, this, we identify with this, and this is our territory. We identify with this, and this is our territory. You have a conflict of identity. My identity is defined in a way that violates your identity. And your identity is defined in a way that violates my identity. So there's an overlap of identity. Now, in collisions of identity, you have the law of mass, whichever is bigger. A pinball and a bowling ball are moving towards one another, and the pinball and the bowling ball collide. Now, what happens when a little steel pinball collides with a 20 or 30 pound bowling ball? What happens? Well, the pinball goes flying, and the bowling ball continues on its course, and so you have the law of mass. So the law of mass dictates that if an entire country and regime are committed to their identity, and the journalist is committed to their identity, we have Julian Assange and Edward Snowden. Julian Assange and Edward Snowden have been banished, tortured, and exiled by multiple U.S. regimes, specifically for telling the truth that undermined the legitimacy of the cult and the regime, because we were supposedly going to Iraq to find weapons of mass destruction on a war on an emotion. So that was our identity. We have got to fight terror. We're going to fight feelings. And in order to do that, we have to stop the bad guys, that's Saddam Hussein, from developing weapons of mass destruction. So we don't like killing people. We believe in sovereignty and this and that and the other, but we've got to find the weapon of mass destruction. And so we became the weapon of mass destruction. We destroyed oil wells, we destroyed buildings, we destroyed people's lives. We killed 1 million innocent Iraqis, looking for a weapon of mass destruction that we were. Now, that's a piece of data, that's a piece of truth that goes contrary to the U.S. identity. No, we're not the weapon of mass destruction. We're looking for the weapon of mass destruction. Those million Iraqi lives in response to, 3,000 Americans dying? None of them bombed by Iraqis? No. We're rescuing Iraq from tyranny. Our smart bombs, Abu Ghraib, tormenting prisoners, defecating on them, raping them, tying them up in bags and shocking them. This is an outrage to the righteous identity. We're the righteous ones protecting the world and bringing democracy. We're not terrorists. We're not animals. The fact that we terrorize an entire country doesn't make us terrorists. We're just terrorizing them in the war on feelings. And Julian Assange published the Abu Ghraib documents. They made the United States question its identity. Are we really the people who sanction human rights violations, cause 2 million Iraqis to develop PTSD, bully people right and left, hire mercenaries who don't follow? Is that really what we are? Is that the good old capitalist war? We didn't want to look at it. And so Chelsea Manning was sent death threats. Julian Assange media company was reclassified as an intelligence terrorist organization. Why? Because they were challenging the identity of the United States. Edward Snowden had to flee to Russia, had his passport revoked on his way to Peru. Joe Biden frantically calling all around the world, don't let Edward Snowden land in your country. Do not grant him political asylum. We have got to hide the fact that our president has been breaking the law in more egregious ways, violating more rights of Americans than any criminal in the country. That this is done at the highest level. No, we don't want to deal with this. It's a disrupting narrative to the identity. So every single person in the United States who wants to hold the identity, no, we're the good guys. We'd never do this. We don't, no. We're not the weapon of mass destruction. We're looking for it while we kill 1 million innocent Iraqis. We're going to find it at some point. Oh, well. Our one sloppy intelligence source, Guccifer 668, I guess he didn't know what he was talking about. See you. Enjoy your 1 million dead. We'll be back on the war on terror in our next episode. It's a joke. It's an utter joke. But it's deadly serious to people whose identity is invested in that joke, in that lie. And each person has a load on them. Meaning every person has an identity that has helped them survive in a system of identities, an occult identity. They've all got identities. And they have the fear of the unknown, pushing against change in that identity. They have the fear of the unknown. They also have the fear of the unknown of all the people around them. You know, in power structures at Washington or Baghdad or whatever, when a threat comes that would bring change, the power structure rapidly gets on text and phone, make sure this doesn't happen. Do you realize if I lose my job, you're going to lose your job? And don't think I'm going to do this and this, and do this. You're all going to be threatened. And so the power structure goes to work, the gears get into motion, cancel that person's identity, deny their passport, break the law here, do this, come up with a spin story to make sure that the person is discredited and is character assassinated before what they can say can come out. Oh, phew, we've maintained what? The identity. You haven't maintained sanity, decency, intelligence, love, beauty, truth, or goodness. You've maintained nothing but the status quo. The status quo is there. I'm going to keep my job, so you're going to keep your job. And the status quo continues. When any person wants to break out of a synthetic, an adaptive identity, a lie, a coping mechanism designed to protect an abuser in childhood or whatever, they affect the identities of everyone around them. And to the degree that they affect the identities of everyone around them is the degree that there will be backlash that is a protection of identity. I do not want to change because I'm afraid of change. And if your identity is validated, my identity no longer makes sense. So I'm going to destroy your identity because it is the enemy of my identity. And so you have a very dangerous situation when you have a healthy identity in relationship with corrupted identities. A corrupted identity is an identity that's built with a purpose. I'm the Secretary of the Navy. What's my job? My job is to protect America. Well, if I go and incite war in a way that damages the entire planet, number one, and two, depletes America's treasury, and three, causes the harm of American lives, and four, doesn't do a single thing to protect or benefit America, I've acted out of context with my role. My purpose, the reason for a Navy, was to protect America. I'm the Secretary, I'm the leader of the Navy because I said that that's my commitment to protect America. But what I've just done is I've cost America on multiple dimensions with zero benefit. I've cost her global reputation. I've cost her finances. I've cost her in young men who now have PTSD and will abuse her sons. I've cost her in lies. There's every single level. The whole environment is more toxic with depleted uranium. I've hurt America in every single dimension, maintaining and out of a lie. Where did that come from? What's going on there? Is that for the power structure? Do I have a deal with the arms? Am I going to get bribes from the military complex in my home state that needs a government contract if I can just produce a war? There's a cost to that. But of course, the cost to the identity and the legitimacy of the cult is much bigger if that is known. If you really get, that's how it works. The more money you give to Washington, the more of it gets corrupted into the exact opposite of what it was sent there for. And so you have the corruption of an identity is always threatened by data and threatened by truth. And because you cannot change the truth, the only thing you can do is either smear or silence the truth teller. You can silence the truth teller by killing them. You can silence the truth teller by intimidating them. You can offer the truth teller rewards. Don't tell the truth and you get this, or tell the truth and you get punished. You can do a variety of things to tell the truth teller, in order to silence the truth teller. But you can't get rid of the truth. The data is always there to be measured, to be found. The evidence of the data can sometimes be destroyed if it's very narrow data, but a systemic pattern of data is always there. The same person who made up the basis for a war this year is the same person who can make up a basis for a war or collude with other peoples next year. So everyone has an identity, and there is a load, there is a pressure on maintaining that identity. All wars are wars of identity. In normal circumstances, the law of mass prevails. The bigger identity, 100 million people in a conflict with 1,000 people, a pinball in collision with a bowling ball, the larger identity wins from the law of mass. The law of mass is not the law of intelligence. The law of intelligence dictates that the smallest number of people are always more intelligent than the largest number of people. A little bit more complexly, if you look at the most intelligent things that are being done technologically, philosophically, in any domain, and look at who is doing the very bleeding edge work and practice in that domain, it is always a very small percentage of people. If you look at who's doing average, it's always the largest group of people, and then there's another small group of people behind that are also very small and doing below average. The law of intelligence says that a minority will always be more intelligent, not every minority, but a minority, that a small group of people will be more competent than a large group of people. It's kind of a bit of a given. If you think of who is the person who is, if you think of running, for example, who's the fastest person in the world? The average person or one specific person who beat the world record? Well, one is about as small as you can get. So in intelligence and running, there's only one fastest person in the world. In boxing, there's only one one person in this weight set that's the boxer. And so in the pinnacle of excellence, you're looking for smaller and smaller numbers of people that are extremely competent. And they're always doing something different than the majority. Always. Investing, running, everything. The average person is not behaving and identifying in an identity that this very small group is. So you have the law of mass that dictates that in a collision, the big one always wins. And then you have the law of intelligence that dictates that, ultimately one person is the best at something or other. If you measure a metric of excellence on any continuum, so there's always going to be at best two people, tying, but one person if you repeat the race or the game, whatever it is, you're going to have one person is the best at that. But they will lose in a collision with the majority. Because unless the majority is threatened, and their identity is threatened, and the change offered by the one allows them to regain more of their identity. Think of the polio vaccine. You know, if you're going to die of polio, or you could take a vaccine, which is a new experience and a new idea, you know, developed by one person, well then, you know, Linus Paullus, you know, you'll adapt them, so there's not a conflict. But if you have one person who's proposing a new identity, and you have a large group of people who are able to survive and maintain a status quo without any change, if there's a collision, the larger group usually destroys or consumes the energy of the smaller group, despite the intelligence data that suggests that the smaller group in a distinct intelligent minority is always you know, more intelligent than the majority.